Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm doing my top 10 non-fiction picks for 2020. So I'm filming upstairs in the bedroom because Andy is making cupcakes downstairs and the mixer is very noisy. Today we're going to talk about my favourite non-fiction that I read in 2020, not that was published in 2020, just that I happened to read in last year. And I also have 5 honourable mentions at the end that were not quite good enough to make it to the top 10 but were still a really enjoyable read, and I wanted to mention just because I enjoyed so much of my non-fiction reading. The first book I'm going to talk about is Wilding by Isabella, and this was one of the very first books I read in 2020. It is a nature writing / science writing book that is about Isabella and her husband, who owned a farm that they decided to actually give back to the land in a process called rewilding, in the kind of effort for conservation and kind of environmental reasons. It talks about their individual process, the various kind of species that they reintroduced onto their land, and then looks at some of the scientific kind of points behind why this is a good idea and sort of some of the controversies around it, the reactions of the locals, as well as sort of talking about all the science. It includes lots of really lovely descriptions of all the different kind of nature, and has some really like in-depth conversations about farming and how that should or shouldn't be occurring in the UK, which is going to be especially interesting given Brexit over kind of the next few years, to see what happens to our farming industry. It really, for me, was that perfect blend of like lovely nature writing and then also some more of the like hard science behind it. I listened to it on audiobook, and I do hear that the physical book has got limited references, so that's something which, like, maybe if I'd read it in physical form might have been kind of a point against Isabella, but I really enjoyed it in audiobook form, and it for me sparked a real kind of reinvigorated interest into nature writing, kind of firmly cemented that subgenre as something that I was interested in reading. So for me it does hold a special place in my heart because of the reading that I've gone on to do subsequent, because of my enjoyment of it. The next book I wanted to mention is No Visible Bruises by Louise Snyder, I believe. This was actually one from the BookTube prize, and I definitely would have picked it up if it hadn't been for that prize, so I'm really thankful for that. And this is a book looking at domestic violence against women, and what I really appreciated about this book was it was broken into different sections, and the middle section was looking at what can be done and what is being done in our society to combat domestic violence by changing men's behaviour rather than just providing ways out for women, because it really acknowledged the fact that in a cycle of violence, if you're not the particular woman who's in the relationship, there will be another one. It looks at the link between domestic violence and then also the murders of women, and then connections with that to mass shootings, and it also just like generally had lots of really important information in it. It was American heavy, as these books so often are. It's often harder to find information about the UK, and I don't even know how difficult it is to find information outside of those two very kind of Western countries, but I did really appreciate the kind of systematic, methodical approach that it had to the topic. It didn't feel like it was glorifying or reveling in kind of a voyeuristic way in any of the violence, which can be the case when discussing kind of grisly things in more of a true crime context, and I just really appreciated it sort of structurally. I think it did a very good job on what non-fiction should do in terms of laying out the information, and it's something that I find myself sort of referring back to quite often when coming across different conversations of domestic violence in other content. My brain goes, oh yeah, and that thing in No Visible Bruises, which I think is a mark of a really good non-fiction. Another one that I read because of the prize is How to Be an Antiracist by Ibram x Kendi. I read a couple of books on racism this year, but this one in particular really stood out for me because of its lovely blend between memoir and, again, more systemic issues and kind of looking more sort of statistics. And what I really liked about it was how clear Ibram was at laying out the information. When you're making an argument and discussing kind of more social justice issues like domestic violence or racism, I really appreciate it when the author takes the time to really lay out in a like firm, structured way exactly what their kind of scope of their argument is going to be, what they're attempting to tackle in their book, what things that they won't go into, and what each chapter is trying to do. And for How to Be an Anti-Racist, each chapter is like headed with the particular subcategory that it's looking at how racism interacts with that. So it looks at things like racism and feminism, it looks at colorism, it looks at all sorts of different stuff, but it is really clearly labelled. And again, I just deeply appreciated that. It for me was the first kind of real time that I sort of understood a lot more of the like systemic stuff that happens within racism beyond just the kind of individual person on person kind of discrimination that happens there. So it definitely sparked a lot more further reading for me and was a very enjoyable, maybe the wrong word, but kind of satisfying reading experience in terms of how I felt like I sort of grew through reading it and how much more I felt like I knew afterwards, if that makes sense. Going into the realm of natural history, which will feature heavily on this list because we all know it's my favourite subgenre, I have Tamed by Alice Roberts. This is about the 10 species that changed our world, and it's 10 different species that we've either domesticated or cultivated, whether it be animals or plants, across human history, and how they have impacted our lives today and kind of shaped human evolution. It's a really incredible book, and for me was my kind of early foray into moving more towards prehistoric rather than paleontology, and I deeply enjoyed all the information. I loved the bits of kind of modern day rhetoric that Alice pulls in, the kind of conversations about like GM crops and kind of genetic modification of animals and sort of interbreeding, and the various conversations that are happening there around pedigree. But it also was just like so much information that was really just so interesting about prehistoric life and the various interactions we've had, and what makes an animal or plant domesticated / cultivated compared to just one that we have some kind of symbiotic relationship with. Alice Roberts has a lovely writing style, and each chapter takes on a different species, so you can treat it almost like a collection of standalone essays that for me helped me to feel really like concise and clear with where the information was and what we were doing with it. It was so wonderful, and Alice Roberts is also lovely. If you ever see her as a guest on a science podcast, you definitely want to listen to that podcast because she's going to be great. Sticking with animals, I really enjoyed Mama's Last Hug by Frans de Waal. This is looking at animal emotion and the various things that we can learn about the hidden lives of animals, and sort of the way that science has changed its understandings of how animals interact and how rich their inner lives genuinely are. It has a main focus on primatology because that is Frans de Waal's expert area. He's incredible in that area, but it also covers all sorts of other things, including like hierarchies within dog packs, rats playing, all sorts of really fun stuff. I adore animals. I'm now moving into an industry where I get to work with them, hopefully learning to be a veterinary nurse soon. So for me, it was just such a wonderful read, and it's fascinating the number of people who don't think that animals have emotions or rich inner lives, and sort of the incredible speciesism that we have really applied to our understandings of animals over the years, and how it's only really in recent years that that's genuinely shifting, and that's within a scientific community. It's not necessarily fully shifting within the general public. I think if you're a fan of animals in any way, shape or form, you will absolutely adore this book. It again is very clear and concise and laid out. It's something which I enjoy in nearly all my non-fiction, so it's something that you're going to kind of hear constantly repeated in this video. It is a mark of good non-fiction for me. A springathon read now, and that is Waterfalls of Stars by Rosanne Alexander, My 10 Years on the Island of Skomar. This is the memoir of Rosanne Alexander, who was a warden of the island of Skomar, which is like a nature reserve off the coast of Britain, which only ever has like 2 people basically living on it most of the time, the warden and their wife normally. So Rosanne was living on the island with her husband for 10 years, and their job was kind of basically being in charge of various conservation efforts and sort of just being a presence on there to keep an eye on it. It is a very isolating experience, but it was also a very beautiful experience, and the nature writing in this is just stunning. I was reading this in the time of lockdown, and it was just like the perfect distraction, getting to read about seals and puffins and the incredible difficulties of living as such an isolated life, but also the incredible wonders of sort of the like nature at its finest as such. It's beautiful, it's stunning, it's not trying to teach you anything. It can be a little bit disjointed in places. You don't necessarily get to hear the end of a couple of the anecdotes, but it's just a love letter to this island and to British sort of nature in general, and because of that it will hold such a special place in my heart. Branching off into social science, we have Humankind, A Hopeful History by Rutger Bregman. This is a re-look at some of the various kind of common anecdotes both in psychology, sociology and history that get brought up when we talk about how evil and bad humankind can be. So it's re-looking at things like the Stanford Prison Experiment, the murder of Kitty Genovese, and all sorts of like other things, other kind of classic hallmarks of sort of pop culture and our general knowledge understanding of like human beings doing terrible things to other human beings, and instead giving it a bit more of a hopeful look and saying, hey, this might not be actually all that it seems. It's kind of part debunking and then part sort of treatise about why humanity can do such terrible things against each other, and it's really just an incredible reimagining and re-understanding of a lot of social science, and it's just such an important read with everything that's happening in the pandemic. It is a great book. It's quite a big book, but I do think it's totally worth it, and if you're a fan of this, you'll probably like the podcast You're Wrong About as well. Veering back into the world of natural history, I had to mention The Ends of the World by Peter Brannen. Brannen. This is an incredible book if you're interested in paleontology, and most importantly about it, in some ways, it doesn't just look at the dinosaurs. This is the book that I credit with opening my eyes to the incredible wonders that the world has, both before and after the dinosaurs, and sort of branching out my love of paleontology, which was very dino heavy beforehand. It's looking at the five major mass extinctions that have happened on our planet, but also what was going on the planet directly before, and what did life look like. Peter Brannen has a wonderful writing style. It's got that lovely blend of wry humour, science, and like little anecdotes about the various people who work in the field of paleontology, and it's just incredible and very vivid all round. His descriptions of what will have happened to the planet are genuinely like chilling, and it is incredible that life has ever managed to survive half these things. It's also especially prescient and interesting because the later part of the book does talk about the climate crisis that we are facing now, the connections between that and the other mass extinctions that have happened in terms of similar things happening in the carbon cycle and things like that. So it's important from more of a kind of a general environmental science book, as well as it is about sort of history of our planet in general. My final two books are memoirs, which is pretty impressive because I'm not normally a huge memoir person, but one that I have had that was a real surprise spur of the moment read that just was absolutely beautiful was Heavy by Kiese Laymon. This is the memoir of a black man who lived in America, and it's a combination of looking at his interactions with racism, but also it is mainly focused on his interactions with his and relationship with his own body. He was very fat when he was young, and it was about him kind of going through a process of losing a lot of that weight, but then also still having a very unhealthy relationship with his body, sort of an obsession with exercise, and potentially dabbling a little bit with kind of anorexic tendencies. It's also a look at his relationship with his mother, and it is actually written to his mother, so where the mother is referred to in second person. I listened to this on audiobook, and one of the things that I absolutely loved about this book was kind of the physicality of it. There was a real sense of kind of rhythm and pace to it that I deeply appreciated, and because it was so focused on his body, even when we were in moments where his body was not like the main focus and we weren't looking at his relationship with his body, it was still a real heavy presence within the book. You kind of felt like you were in his skin. It was just an incredibly moving piece of non-fiction, and honestly I haven't read a memoir that is even vaguely close to it. It was absolutely phenomenal. A fantastic book in a very different kind of trend is Unfollow by Roper-Phelps, I believe. This one she is the granddaughter of the gentleman who set up the Westboro Baptist Church, who are a very, very aggressively anti-gay and generally quite aggressive evangelicalist church in the US. They're very famous for doing things like boycotting the funerals of military individuals and just generally boycotting a lot of different things. They have websites like We Hate the US and We Hate whatever, and it is about Megan's time growing up in this essentially kind of cult and very extremist views, talking about her relationships, her family, and how you can kind of be within these views, and then also about her learning to question these views and then subsequently leaving and what that meant for her. What I love about this book was it felt very, very honest and objective. It is so hard in memoir to write honestly about anybody's experiences because human memory is just not set up for that kind of thing, but I think Megan has a real objective view at looking at the good and bad in her family and trying to really come to terms with the idea of loving her parents and loving her family while still also acknowledging the amount of hate and kind of badness, for lack of a better word, that they have put out into the world. She talks about the process of trying to question, and it does look a little bit about how people can be radicalized into these very extremist views, but the book is not really doing that. It's mainly focused on a very personal experience. So if you're looking for a book that explains kind of radicalization, this is not the book for you. It is about her personal journey, so just kind of something to bear in mind. So those are my top 10 books, but I do have a couple of very quick honorable mentions because, oh my god, 2020 was a really great reading year for me for non-fiction, and I felt remiss not mentioning them. So we're gonna super quickly blitz through. We're talking like one sentence as to why I love them. So we have Witches by Tracey, which is an incredible and very detailed look at the witch trials off of James I, and it's just an incredible look at sort of witch trials in general and then this particular sort of micro event, and it does the amazing thing where it talks about the macro via the micro, and it's just great all around. Totally recommend. Dinosaurs Without Bones, my favourite paleontology read this year, but like totally not accessible if you don't understand a little bit about paleontology already. This is looking at ichnology, which is the study of trace fossils and kind of the evidence left behind independent to bones. It was so detailed and so fantastic, and just really again opened my eyes to a whole new area of paleontology. Absolutely incredible, and really just got super geeky and nerdy. So like I say, if you're not au fait with a few of the paleontology terms out there, if you haven't read a couple of books about dinos already, don't pick this one up. It's not an entry level book, but if you are a big fan of paleontology, this one is fantastic and totally deserves a place on your shelf. We Were 8 Years in Power by Ta-Nehisi Coates is my all-time favourite essay collection I have ever read. I normally don't do essay collections. This is mind-blowing. So it is a collection of 8 essays which were written throughout the time of the Obama administration, looking at a variety of different aspects of his, I nearly said reign, I do this every time, term? Presidency. I don't know what the word is. Also alongside it is kind of a paragraph either at the beginning or the end, I can't quite remember which, looking where Ta-Nehisi Coates looks at his writing and kind of says what he agrees with still, what he doesn't agree with, how he might have changed how he wrote about it. It covers a huge range of different topics and is absolutely fantastic when looking at sort of the political climate of America now and also through the years of Obama. Amazing. Queer Intentions by Amelia Abraham is a personal journey through the LGBTQ+ culture, and is a wonderful look at how far queer rights have come, but also the things that have been sacrificed along the way. It is not quite a distinct collection of essays, but each chapter focuses on a slightly different aspect, and it talks about things like the commodification of things like drag queens and the drag queen community with kind of RuPaul's Drag Race and what has that done for the community, both good and bad. All sorts of different conversations about the fight for various rights, and it's essentially looking at when a marginalised community becomes less marginalised, what is lost along the way in terms of culture. It's an amazing read and had just kind of sparked so many really interesting conversations for me. It was so good. And then the final one is Roaring Girls by, I can't remember the author, I'm really sorry, and this is 8 individual women who have been forgotten feminists throughout history. It's looking at the lives of these 8 women and the various kind of things that they have contributed, but it's also looking at the conversation of how difficult it can be to apply things like the label of feminism to people historically, and how anachronistic that can be, and just sort of how appropriate is it when we try to reclaim various people through history. It's a really interesting look at these 8 women who I didn't know very much about, so it opened my eyes to lots of different interesting lives kind of throughout British history in general, but it also is a really interesting conversation about how do we approach history, especially for people who have not been talked about very much and we don't necessarily have much written record about them because they are forgotten voices as such for whatever reason, and how do we still do them justice without trying to overlay a lot of our own modern sensibilities on top of their lives. Super important for lots of different reasons. So that is it from me. Those are the top 10 plus 5 honourable mentions to kind of top 15 non-fiction books for 2020. It was such a good year for non-fiction. I've said that already, but like this was honestly such a hard list to do. Way harder than the fiction one, even though I read technically like way fewer non-fiction books, and I've definitely really enjoyed prioritising my non-fiction reading. It's something that I'm going to try and continue to do this year, and I've been enjoying a decent number of the non-fiction I've been reading already, so fingers crossed it's going to be a cracking year as well. Have you read any of these? Are any of them on your favourites list? Have any of them been added to your TBR because of what I've said? Let me know everything in the comments down below. My fiction favourites will be coming up next, so do keep an eye out for that in the next few days. Have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye!